Well, you guys picked it. What is going on, guys? Welcome to The Reformed Reader, the channel where we review different forms of media through the lens of a Christian who is under the authority of the scriptures. My name is Josh, and today we are going to be doing a book review of Piñata by Leopoldo Gout. Now, before we jump into the review, let's go over what is this book about. Now, normally when I do this section, I break this down with sort of like a little cinematic trailer. I throw some pictures up and I do some voiceover stuff and add some music to it. But instead, I want to change things up a little bit since this is a different type of review. So instead, I just kind of want to tell you guys what this plot is about. So the overall plot of this story is we are following a character named Carmen, who is a Mexican-American who has been hired as an architect to go and refurbish an old church down in Mexico and help turn it into a hotel. Well, upon working there, crews stumble upon a hidden wall, and they realize that this old church down in Mexico actually originally served as an ancient Mayan temple. And they broke through this secret wall where there are all kinds of Mayan artifacts, most of which are pretty nefarious in nature. And one of these artifacts is this clay pot. Now, they refer to this clay pot as a piñata. Now, this is not the typical piñata that you and I think of, the one at kids' birthday parties where they smack it open and candy comes out. This is more of a ritualistic urn. And what it was traditionally used for is it contains parts of human anatomy from ritual sacrifices. Because of that sort of nefarious and malicious nature, this artifact carries with it a malicious spirit. And so we are following Carmen and her two daughters, one of which, the youngest, is sort of in tune to the spiritual world. And so because of that, she becomes susceptible to the spiritual world. And so she is, let's just say, compelled to smuggle this urn out of this ancient temple and carry it home with her. And because of that, all types of evil ensues afterwards, where she is being visited by the spirit, sometimes compelled by the spirit to do certain things or cause other people to see things. And then ultimately she brings it back with her to New York. And so then throughout the story, we are following Carmen and her family trying to purge this spirit, not only from their personal lives, but from the world altogether, because it is going to consume them and everyone around them. If that sounds like your kind of horror book, this will most likely be up your alley. Now, before we go into the review, I just want to clarify that this book was actually chosen by you all. So last month, in case you missed it, last month I did a video where I judged books solely on their covers. I went to my local bookstore. I pulled 5 books off the shelves, completely based on how cool I thought the cover looked, and you guys voted, and this one won. And I think rightfully so. It has a very cool cover to it. So I'm reading this really outside of my wheelhouse. I'm not really steeped in the horror genre, but the cover did look awesome. And so I guess that's why you guys voted for it and why I read it. So now let's talk about how I normally structure my reviews. Now, the way I normally go over my reviews is I go over the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good being the things about the book that I enjoyed, the bad being the things about the book that I didn't care so much for. And these are preferential things. But then I go over the ugly, which is what could be some sin that is steeped into this book that might hold a Christian back from picking it up? And I break that down into 5 categories. But before we get into that, let's go over the good. What were some things about this book that I enjoyed? The setting and the themes. So the setting was excellent. And by the setting, I don't just mean in sort of this ancient Mayan ruin. I also mean the setting as this book carries that same sense of looming dread that Dracula does or Frankenstein. It has a very similar feel to it. So because of that, it has that, as soon as you open the book, you have that sort of eerie, looming dread over your shoulder while you're reading it. Some people are really averse to that, but if you enjoy that type of thing, I think, hey, this may be something that you want to check out. So that's number 1. Number 2, the history behind piñatas, because I did some research afterwards. I'm like, is that really what it is? And it is loosely based on that. I definitely think there were some liberties taken here, but it was cool to find out some of this history about what piñatas could have been or may have been used for. So that was excellent. And our villain, our antagonist, and I don't want to get too far into it because I do want to keep this spoiler free, but obviously it is this spirit is wicked. And I mean that in all kinds of ways, probably in all of the ways. But the description of how this spirit appeared was creepy. I mean, which it's supposed to be, but man, it was really, really creepy. I definitely enjoyed the pacing. This is a very fast-paced book. It's not a thick book. It's like 230, 240 pages. I read it in a couple of days, in just a few sittings. And so you will fly through it pretty quickly. And the author tends to skip the parts that are sort of inconsequential. That is refreshing coming from reading epic fantasy and real thick sci-fi books, because, you get really steeped into the world building. This is like, hey, you're dropped into modern day Mexico, so you don't really have to work on all that world building. You kind of know what to expect here. So there are definitely some pros here that I think probably an avid horror reader will really enjoy. But that leads me into the bad. What were some things about this book that I did not enjoy? And unfortunately, there is quite a bit. I would say I was mixed to negative on this book. I probably was more negative on this book, and there's a few reasons. Number one, our characters. Our characters were pretty forgettable. Carmen and her two daughters seemed kind of like throwaways. They were definitely, and no pun intended here, but they were just kind of vessels used to kind of move the story along. They were just kind of seemed like board game pieces that just kind of, ticked along. You didn't really get involved in their personality, and so they seemed very kind of cookie cutter, in my opinion. On top of our characters, I definitely think the writing is not 5-star. So I think the author is a good writer, but I think that he paid attention to detail on the things that I do not care for. So he paid attention to a lot of the more grotesque details, a lot of the more gory type things, and not so much on the things that I care about, like character development or like character motivations and those kinds of things. So I definitely think he sacrificed some of that in order to write more of the more like horror elements, which again, this is a horror book. So I'm not trying to just like, throw all that out the window and act like that I'm not taking that into consideration, because I am. But I will say that I think the things that most people, especially those of us not well versed in horror, who are kind of dipping our toes in it or maybe picking it up like I did because, hey, the cover looked cool, that I think your reading experience will suffer because he sacrificed character development, writing style, pacing, plot, setting, and those kinds of things for gruesome details, for lack of a better term. So that's part of it. But if you would permit me just a minute to kind of go over my biggest nitpick, and it's that there was quite a bit of agenda steeped in here. Now, what I mean by that, and I know as soon as I say that, everybody's like, oh, Josh always has a problem with every book that he reads. I definitely don't think that's the case, and I definitely don't look for those kinds of things, but it is sometimes difficult for me to miss or to avoid. And so there were things in this book that I really not only didn't enjoy, but that I absolutely didn't agree with. For instance, in large part, there are several instances of our author blaming white people. There are several uses of like white people bad, white man bad. His history is inaccurate in a lot of ways. So what I mean by that is there are a couple of flashbacks where it talks about settlers and colonizers, especially from Spain, coming over and all the atrocities they committed towards the Mayan people. And while some of that very well may be true, the vast majority of it is not. And so the author definitely painted a picture that made it seem like every settler or colonizer is this evil, debased reprobate. And that before these settlers came in, that the Mayans were doing nothing wrong, that they just lived in peace together. And there's several issues that I take with that. But let me, rather than go off on my own personal opinions here and give you my propaganda or agenda or whatever, instead I'm going to say, I'm just going to ask a question here, which is, if the Mayans at that time were living completely in peace and they weren't doing anything wrong, then why in the world was the entire premise of the book, a piñata, why was it filled with body parts of human sacrifices? Some of which I believe we were supposed to assume were children. So maybe that's part of it. So maybe these colonizers and these settlers weren't all bad. Maybe they were trying to keep these people from committing atrocities against their own people. And so that's definitely an issue that I take with it, because it seems like our author decided to take historical fact and just tweak it a little bit. Because look, this is a thing that kind of drives me nuts when people use history in their books to promote an agenda one way or the other, is that especially if you're trying to paint people in a bad light, you don't have to twist history to show that. There's enough true atrocities that took place that you don't have to try to warp, or just to be frank, to lie about what actually occurred in order to get your point across. Now, some people may say, well, it's not a lie because he's writing fiction and so blah, 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 blah. Yes and no. Okay, there's some, I'm going to give some pushback there by saying, yes, he's writing fiction, but then he's making statements in this novel as if they are factual, and they are not. They just aren't. They are based, in fact, they are rooted in history, but ultimately they became historical fiction because he just deliberately omitted things or deliberately skewed things a certain way in order to paint a picture against colonizers and settlers and all those kinds of things. So that's number one. But then he also did that in particular with Christians. Now, why did he do that? You'd have to ask him. I have my assumptions, but I'm going to leave them as that. But I will say this, if you're asking me, well, what do you mean? Like, why did he deliberately come out and attack Christians? It was really for no reason at all. So there were things where our main character's daughter, who is dealing with these spiritual things, she decides that, this thing is affecting her personality and her moods, and she becomes very snappy and ugly towards people. And then she just blows up in class one day, which made sense for the story until she said, it's all of you white people, and it's all of you privileged white people, and you disgusting, I'm trying to remember verbatim what it said, you disgusting Christians. And there was something else in there. It was like Bible believing Christians. It's your fault that we were oppressed. It wasn't like there was like one big instance that this occurred. It was just little instances throughout the story that it occurred continuously. And so I definitely took issue with that. On top of that, there were parts of this book that were just kind of gross. Now, again, I understand that it's horror, so I kind of know what I was getting into. And I wasn't like, well, I'm going to knock it a point because it was gross. No, I understood what it was going into it. But it was a little gratuitous at times. Again, I understand as sort of the nature of the genre and of his story in particular, but allow me to submit to you that I think personally that he wrote this novel with the hopes that it would be optioned for a movie. That's really what it seemed like. It seemed like an unfinished story, or maybe not a super polished horror story that he hoped could be turned into a movie. Because let me just go ahead and tell you that this probably would have worked a lot better as a film and not as a novel, in my opinion. I definitely think a lot of the visualizations would have been more compelling and interesting if I actually visualized them rather than just trying to imagine them, especially when the author is not being overt with certain descriptions about what is taking place and is more concerned about the blood and guts side of it, if that makes any sense to you. I know it sounds like I'm just like, this book was terrible. That's not the case. I just had issues with it. I definitely did. So this leads me to the ugly, which is what could be some sin that is steeped into this work that might hold a Christian back from picking it up. And I break this down into 5 categories, starting with violence and brutality. Now, for violence and brutality, I'm going to give this an 8. Yeah, it's pretty high. Obviously, you're dealing with a horror book. On top of that, you're dealing with spiritual elements. So you're going to deal with a lot of violent things. You're going to be talking about sacrifices. He's going to go into detail about those descriptors of what took place there. And on top of that, all of the things that this spirit either causes this girl to do or that this spirit causes itself. Yeah, they're pretty violent and extremely brutal. So this brings me to category 2, which is sexually explicit content. Now, for sexually explicit content, I'm going to give this a 3. That's pretty low. And the reason why I'm going to give it a 3 is because there is just some mentioning of certain types of assault. It does not go into detail, does not describe these things, but it does kind of speak around what took place. In large part, it's it's an accusation towards the settlers and colonizers about this is what they did, this is why we hate them, those kind of things. And then on top of that, we're dealing with 3 female main characters. And so there is definitely some concern there, especially it being a horror book, about there being different types of assault towards these young ladies. So not a lot, but it is talked around, if that makes sense. So this brings me to category 3, which is language. And for language, I'm going to give this an 8. Yeah, it's pretty high. Pretty much every type of language and blasphemy is used in this book. Pretty heavy. The blasphemy is not used as heavily. So for those of you that are like, there are certain words that are just, I nope out of real quick. My brother Ted, I know there's a certain term that he just has a huge aversion to, as do I. I don't remember that one being in there, but I would not be surprised if it is in there. So I'm going to give it pretty high because because bombs are dropped pretty frequently. So the language is pretty heavy, but again, you kind of expect it going into the horror genre, especially this type of horror. You can't pick up this book and think, oh, this is going to be completely clean. Obviously, that's not going to be the case. So yeah, the language in here is pretty heavy. So this leads me into category 4, which is gratuitous inclusions. Now for gratuitous inclusions, I'm going to give this a 7. What I mean by this is there's not gratuitous inclusions of like same-sex characters or gratuitous inclusions of race swapping or anything like that, or even race baiting or racial slurs one way or the other. But we are definitely dealing with a skewed worldview. And I hit on this earlier, but yeah, there's a big skewed worldview here. What I mean by gratuitous inclusions here is, yes, there are inclusions about historical inaccuracies that are included in the story for the sole purpose to slander certain people groups. So that's how I'm painting it in this scenario. So if that's how I'm looking at it, which it is, then I'm going to say, yeah, it's pretty high for my taste. I don't think it's, as high as it could be, but it definitely affected my reading experience. And so this brings me to the final category, which is dark themes. And for dark themes, I'm going to give this an 8. Yeah, pretty high. Obviously, you're dealing with, spiritual beings, evil spirits. You're dealing with like really wicked stuff. You're dealing with not just like voodoo type stuff, but yeah, it's demons, demonic type things, rituals. So yeah, it's pretty high. For some people, I'm just going to go ahead and say, for some of us, some of you maybe, this may be your kind of thing. You may love those type of horror books. You may love those types of movies. Again, if you like the movie The Ruins, I think you'll like this. I think you'll like this a lot. So don't think that I'm just detracting from it, but I do want to try to paint you the best picture that I can of my experience with this book. And so this leads me to the final question, which is, would I recommend it to a Christian? And obviously, probably not. As a matter of fact, I would say definitely not, with few exceptions. So I would say I definitely wouldn't recommend this to the vast majority of people. Would I recommend this to somebody? Maybe. I don't necessarily know that I could recommend it in the sense that I am signing off on it. And what I mean by that is saying that like I'm giving my stamp of approval of someone else to read this, or I'm saying, hey, Josh's stamp of approval says that you will enjoy this. I don't think I personally could do that, just because I don't necessarily know that there's anybody that I know personally that I could recommend this to. There's a few people that I interact with here on YouTube or over Instagram, or even a couple of personal friends that really, really love horror. And if you really, really love horror and you're looking for something that's just kind of, outside the box, that is different, that's a quick standalone read, you may really enjoy this. But this book was not for me. Obviously, if you guys have been watching, listened to me at all, this was just not my type of read. I did finish it. Wasn't crazy about it. I gave this book a 4 out of 10 or 2 stars over on Goodreads. I definitely had my problems with it. It will not be a reread. However, I do want to emphasize that I don't regret reading it. And here's why. Because I reached outside of my comfort zone into a different genre that I otherwise wouldn't have read without the help of you guys. And it's allowed me to explore other reading options. So it has actually led me to go, maybe there's some things in this genre that might actually pique my interest. Now, I don't think there's going to be anything in the same vein as this that's going to click with me. Maybe Mr. Leopoldo Gout just is not an author for me, and that's okay, because I don't think there's any author that is for everybody. So because of that, I will definitely say that I don't regret reading this, because it has caused me since then, when I've gone into the bookstore, to look over on the horror section and go, that looks kind of interesting, which beforehand I wouldn't have even traveled over to that area. I would have just stuck to the sci-fi and fantasy sections. So I am glad that I read it and reached outside of my wheelhouse, because it has also helped me kind of hone in what my tastes are and sort of where my threshold is on some things. So again, I don't think I personally could recommend this to many people. I definitely think there is a market for this out there, obviously, because I think he's doing pretty well in sales, and it actually has a pretty good rating overall over on Goodreads. But again, don't take my word for it. Go and look at some other reviews. Go and look at some reviews over on Goodreads, see what other people had to say about it, and look at every type of review from 5-star to 1-star and see what people say, and see if you can kind of get a general consensus. But just for me, this wasn't a book for me, but I am really looking forward to doing a challenge like this again, because it was really fun, and it just left me not really knowing what to expect. So I'm really looking forward to the next time that we do a challenge like this, and you guys help me pick out a book. Thank you guys so much for coming and hanging out with me, and I will see you on the next one.